It now gives me great pleasure to introduce colleague and good friend, Professor Viv Bozalek from University of Western Cape, where she is, her background is in social work, Professor of Social Work, but she's now the Director of Teaching and Learning. And she's done all sorts of work looking at the intersection of knowledge and affect, knowledge and care, and in particular the pedagogy of care, and you heard her speaking briefly at the panel discussion last night. We look forward to her talking now. Unfortunately, Viv has to leave on the dot of 12:30 if she's going to make her plane. So it may mean that we have some questions and discussions after she's left, but I think we probably will have some time to throw some questions at you before you leave. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sue, for inviting me. It's been really a very rich experience being here, and I've really enjoyed meeting the people that I have. And I just want to say that I think people are so lucky to be on this program. It's just really a sort of intellectually rich program, and I think quite an exemplary one. I haven't heard of others. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So thanks very much for inviting me, and I will try and make time for questions before I leave, so that I don't just leave after the presentation. So Sue asked me to talk about the political ethics of care, which I did speak a little bit about last night, but I also thought that we could look first at care and social justice, and how they are different from each other and how they intersect. So the way in which I'm looking at care is really as an alternative moral framework. Moral frameworks really look at how things ought to be, and allow us to make complex moral judgments about things like policies, practices, etc. And so we've really used the political ethics of care to look at a number of different practices and policies, both in the field of social services and also in higher education. I think Joan Tronto is one of the most famous theorists in the political ethics of care. And a lot of her work these days is about how care is an alternative paradigm to neoliberalism. And so in order to be critically aware of the pernicious effects of neoliberalism and its hegemonic discourses on higher education, we really need to access other vocabularies, ways of defining problems, and understanding policies of practice and practices such as teaching and learning in higher education. So in other words, other normative frameworks. And the ethics of care provides one such framework. So I'm going to be looking at social justice, the ethics of care, and how both of these perspectives bring difference into the equation, because for me difference is important. So social justice approaches are traditionally concerned with how social resources are distributed in society. And I say that these are only partially useful, as really there's no accommodation of difference in these approaches. So the idea of the rational economic man, who is disembodied, autonomous and independent and equal, is the normative ideal of the citizen that John Rawls had in mind. This man is also able to enter voluntarily into the exchange of goods and social cooperation with other citizens for his own benefit. Now, the capabilities approach of Sen and Nussbaum and Nancy Fraser's trivalent concept of justice and the political ethic of care all offer a different approach to John Rawls's, in that they do accommodate difference. they accommodate difference, particularity, otherness, plurality, vulnerability, and context. So they look at the concrete other as opposed to the generalized other about whose circumstances we know nothing. So the sorts of questions which these approaches, care and justice, allow us to ask in relation to various contexts are things like, what are students or lecturers able to be and to do? What capabilities can they exercise? How are they privileged or disadvantaged? And what implications does this have for their lives? Are they able to interact on a par or on an equal basis with others? And how do they fare in being able to give and receive care in situations of their own choice? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly now look at the capabilities approach and briefly look at Nancy Fraser, and then I'm going to spend much more time on the political ethics of care, because this is really the focus of our discussion today. I don't know if you've had anything on the capabilities approaches yet. No. Well, probably most people know that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum are pioneers of this approach. And what's attractive about it is that it does address both the general and the particular. It takes into account where people are positioned and what they are able to do with personal, social, and material resources. And it does not start from the assumption that we are equally placed in relation to resources. So in this approach, resources in themselves are not really meaningful in assessing human flourishing. But particularity and context are important in deciding which resources are needed and how they will be effective, how effective they'll be for being able to flourish. So as I've said, the liberal idea of equality predicated on equal agents is challenged in this approach. It looks at people as ends rather than as means to ends. In other words, as valuable in their own right and as sources of agency rather than aggregations. So instead of looking generally at households or families, it looks at how particular groups of people are able to flourish, like children in relation to elders or women in relation to men, etc., etc. So the good life, according to Sen and Nussbaum, is the ability to do valuable things and achieve valuable states, as well as being able to choose from different livings and meaningful affiliations, and not to be constrained into a particular form of life. In order to promote the good life, participatory parity, and human flourishing, a particular person's needs in terms of his or her current situation would have to be considered. So, for example, first generation literate versus rural students versus urban middle-class students from literate homes would need more and different resources. This is why resources in themselves are not that meaningful. In order to achieve the valuable beings and doings, you would need different things depending on who you are and where you're coming from. According to the capabilities approach, individual preferences or desires are also not always reliable indicators of human needs, as those who are advantaged or disadvantaged easily become accustomed to their situations and adjust their expectations and aspirations accordingly. And Sen talks about the small mercies that people are, grateful for. So this, in terms of education and, doing evaluations of students' needs, these things don't really tell one much, because depending on one's prior experience, you may not have such great expectations about the particular situation you find yourself in. Nussbaum has also specifically looked at education, and she sees these three things as being important for education. She talks about critical self-examination, so of oneself and one's traditions. What she refers to as the examined life. So it requires a critical perspective on our beliefs, traditions, and habits. And then the idea of the world citizen, where we need to develop the ability to see ourselves not only as belonging to a local community, but also as bound to all other human beings by a concern for the global world. This is what I was talking about last night in the concern for distant others, not only those close to oneself. And then she says one needs the development of a narrative imagination. So what it could be like to be in the place of someone else. And to imagine what somebody different from oneself is experiencing. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she wrote a book called Not for Profit, where she's arguing for the continuation of the humanities, although, there's a lot of dispute about just accepting the humanities as they are. She sees that it's important to maintain the humanities, and these are the things that she talks about as being important for education: the capacity to see the world from the viewpoint of others, especially those who are othered. Dependency or weakness is not shameful and to be looked down upon. Here's the resonance with the ethics of care. Need should be acknowledged and as an opportunity for cooperation, a genuine concern for others, both near and distant, also similar to the ethics of care. And then she has written books about disgust when thinking about others who are less than, and she's saying we need to undermine this, to counter stereotypes with real and true things about others, to promote responsibility by making students accountable, and then again the critical thinking. Going to move on to Nancy Fraser's views of justice. Chrissy Bowie and myself actually wrote a paper on higher education using Nancy Fraser's notion of misframing. For anyone who's interested, I could send that to you. But for Nancy Fraser, what she means by social justice is the ability to participate on an equal level with others. And she says that there are 3 dimensions which affect this. The first is the economic dimension, or the distribution of resources, in which she includes things like leisure time, whether one's labor is exploited or not, etc. And then the second is the cultural, which is the recognition of status, whether one's attributes are either recognized or misrecognized, are valued or devalued. So she talks about knowledge as being valued or devalued. And then thirdly, she's just recently brought this in because of her concern with globalization and seeing that it's not only the nation state that's influencing whether we are able to participate as equals, but it's in a globalized world, it's things beyond the nation state. It's things like the digital divide, for example, and the IMF, which is, larger than that. And she talks about that as representation, the political aspect. So all these dimensions affect each other, but she says you can't have one without the other. And I'm not going to go, one could spend a full 1.5 hours on each one of these approaches, the capabilities approach, phrases, all the ethics of care, but I've really been asked to look at the political ethics of care. So it provides another dimension. So in addition to who's able to do what, who's entitled to be what, and who has access to resources, who's afforded recognition or respect, who is excluded or included, it's also necessary to ask who gets assigned to what responsibilities. And this is important for the ethic of care. How are caring responsibilities allocated in society? So the political ethics of care approach enables one to ask questions about the distribution of caregiving work in society, the relations of power which affect this work and are affected by it, and the sorts of practices engaged in to ensure the care of those who need it, and those who don't need it but who have grown to expect that their needs be provided for, even though they can do it themselves. It raises questions about care, dependency, and vulnerability in relation to human flourishing. So this assumption that the world consists of independent, self-sufficient, equally placed humans is erroneous but prevalent. Our social policies are actually based on this. Our work life is based on this assumption. The ethic of care says, no, we are all dependent at different times of our lives, and dependents all need to be cared for. And this has to be factored into the social arrangements of society in ways which are central to human functioning. So recognition that dependency is an inevitable condition of human life, and that it's usually assumed to be a familial obligation, is important. In terms of the ethics of care, dependency is seen as a normal part of human life, and one which should be considered in the social sharing of burdens, just as education, health services, and road maintenance are. And Joan Tronto has developed this notion of privileged irresponsibility, which is something that I've also written on, if anyone is interested in that, where there's a denial of the dependency on another, and where the services of the other are used but not acknowledged. So in many exploitative relationships in our society, we do not recognize that we are dependent on other people for fulfilling our needs, and we tend to take those people for granted. And one could perhaps apply this to teaching in higher education. You know, the binary between teaching and research, and who gets to do the research and who gets to be the teachers. So equality and participation from a care ethics perspective are seen as relational and connection-based, rather than in terms of atomized individuals. So care is dependent on a caregiver and a care receiver. And the political ethics of care locates care both in the public and in the private. It destabilizes notions of what people's natural responsibilities are in terms of gender and generation, and makes moral claims for societal responsibility to ensure that care can be both given and received with some amount of choice and without prejudicing those involved in caring practices. I'll give you an example. If one is looking at the difference between middle class and working class students and women and men students, you often find that women students are having to do much of the caring work in their own context, and therefore having much less time to spend on education, as are students who are having to work. I spoke about this definition last night, and I think Berenice Fisher and Joan Tronto deliberated about this definition for about 3 hours on the bus going to work. It is sort of, they call it a species activity, which I think they got from Marx. But the important thing here is that they see care as a social practice, not just as a disposition. So at the most general level, care consists of everything we do to continue, maintain, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. And then there's a second part to it, which includes ourselves and the environment. So it's looking also beyond humans. And there have been critiques of this definition, but I very much like it. Tronto has also spoken about phases of care. She initially, in her book, her 1993 book called Moral Boundaries, developed 4 phases of care. And she's since added a 5th one. So each one of these phases of care is associated with a moral element. And I'm going to go through. So the first phase is caring about. The next is caring for, caregiving, care receiving, and caring with. So the first phase, which is caring about, is related to the moral element of attentiveness. So it's really recognizing or noticing the existence of a need. And she regards the lack of attentiveness as a moral failing. She doesn't see ignoring as a passive act. She sees it as a very deliberate act. And she would see that as a moral evil, actually. So if one is ignoring a need in front of one, one is not behaving ethically. She also talks about the politics of needs interpretation, the different actors. This comes from Fraser, who decide which needs are going to be the definition of needs will be the ones that we take seriously. And Fraser talks about social movements in relation to the market, and all these different groups describe needs in different ways. And it's one has then a tussle as to whose definition wins out. The second moral aspect of caring is responsibility. So once you recognize that there is a need, it means that somebody has to take responsibility for it. So this is where one is acting in some way to address the needs, what we will and won't do. And it's not really to do with duty and obligations or principle ethics, which are laid out in rules. But it's assuming the responsibility when one sees that that a need needs to be met. The third is caregiving, the hands-on work of caregiving, which is the person actually doing the work. Doing teaching, for example, would be the hands-on work of caregiving. And competence is the moral issue. She says it's a moral issue as well as a technical one. And often you get learned incompetence as a way of avoiding caring work, saying, I'm not good at doing that, you do it, in a way to get out of doing this sort of work. The fourth dimension of care is responsiveness. So there's been an act of care, and you have to assess and think about what happened. And there must be some process of finding out whether the care was effective. So things like evaluations would be a way of getting students seeing how the caregiving, the teaching has been responded to. And the fifth dimension of care is caring with, which she's recently in 2013 added. So once you've gone through the process and reiterated it several times, habits and patterns of care emerge and continue through time. And if care goes well, it will bring with it the moral qualities of trust and solidarity. So all these 5 phases need to be seen in an integral fashion. The integrity of care involves the whole care process that must fit together for good care to take place. So she says there is care. Teaching can be seen as a caregiving activity, a caring activity. But whether it's done well or not will depend on these elements, will depend on your attentiveness, the responsibility, and who's assuming this, etc., etc. So it involves all 5 of the moral elements of care being integrated into a whole. And as I said last night, and it was responded quite well to, care involves more than just good intentions. It requires deep and thoughtful knowledge of a situation and all the actors' situations, needs, and competencies. And it requires knowledge of the context. What is also important in care, of course, is the dialoguing. It's not only the caregiver or the teacher and the student, but there needs to be a relationship of negotiation and dialogue between these people who are giving and receiving care, rather than an abstract, impartial view, as is required by rights-based approaches. So, in using these moral elements, it allows us to ask questions under each one of these. For example, attentiveness. What care is necessary? What types of care now exist? How adequate are they? Who gets to articulate the nature of needs and to say which problems should be cared about? In terms of responsibility, who should be responsible for meeting the needs? How can such responsibility be fixed and why? In terms of competence, who actually are the caregivers? How well can they do their work? Because if you don't have the resources, you obviously can't do your work well. What conflicts exist between them and care receivers? What resources do caregivers need in order to care competently? Responsiveness, how do care receivers respond to the care that they are given? How well does the care proceed as it exists? And are their needs in conflict with one another? And who resolves this conflict? Trust, has care been reliable and reiterated over time? Do caring citizens realize that their needs will be cared for? Is trust developed through the process of care for others? Is care conducted collaboratively rather than individually? Actually, people like Nell Noddings, that I also mentioned last night, see care as a dyadic relationship. These people are very critical of that. They say not even in families is care a dyadic relationship. That is a myth. So in teaching, for example, they would encourage more participants in the caring process rather than just the dyadic. Questions arise from the conflict and integration of care. What conflicts exist to disrupt integrated and complete care? How far apart are the caregivers and the care receivers? And also, how far apart are those who are taking responsibility to the care, those doing caregiving? How far apart is the management at the institution, for example, from the teachers who are on the ground? And, you know, this will influence the care process. What connection exists to make those who claim to care about a particular problem to assume a responsibility for it and pay attention genuinely to its outcome? So I've said that it's really important for care to be done well, that one gets this integrity. And Tronto says, no matter how well we teach, after we've closed the classroom door behind us, the broader political setting of the university makes a huge difference. This is why she argues for a political ethics of care rather than this dyadic notion. So the political ethics of care requires that we change how we perceive morality, how we fix boundaries between the public and the private. It's not an ethic about relationships in a privatized context, but in a public context. It's looking at public policy. And, a lot of care ethicists have deconstructed various public policies from an ethics of care perspective, looking at these moral elements. It requires a change in how we view democracy and justice. We need to look at who's doing the caring work in society and who's getting passes out of it, because they're too important to be doing the caring work. Or they're looking after their families and they can't be looking after distant others. So all these are forms of privileged irresponsibility, where you step out of doing the caring work. And it's got a lot to do, of course, with categories like gender, race, age, and class. So democracy, in terms of Toronto's perspective, is the allocation of caring responsibilities and the assuring that everyone can participate in how those responsibilities are allocated. And as I've said, if certain groups of people like women and children spend a great deal of their time in meeting other people's needs, they're not able to participate on an equal footing because their own needs are not being met. And they also don't have the time to pursue other activities. What I find useful about Toronto is that she's looked at policies and she's looked at institutions in terms of caring. And she's written an article which is in Ethics and Welfare, I think, which looks at the 5 signs, warning signs that an institution isn't a caring one. So the first sign, it would be that misfortune causes care, causes the need for care. Because this is assuming that only certain people need care, and that it's not a generalized, it's regarded as applicable only to the needy and vulnerable people. So from this viewpoint, the centrality and universality of care as a species activity and dependence isn't acknowledged. And we really do need care all the time. So the next one is that needs are taken as objective in the organization. So it doesn't think about needs as political struggles. And the third one is that care is considered a commodity and not a process. So it's something in neoliberal times, they talk about buying care. And care is positioned as a commodity to be purchased on the open market. From this perspective, students may be regarded as consumers or customers who are encouraged to evaluate their higher education experience in terms of the satisfaction rather than in terms of what they're actually learning. Academic teachers are encouraged through prevailing economic discourses to satisfy students' expectations. We can see this happening more and more. This would be regarded as a very bad form of care because it's not seeing teaching or care as a process which aims to challenge, reevaluate, and transform. But it's a service a commodity that's been given. Another way in which care, a problematic way of seeing care, is narrowing it only to caregiving, rather than understanding the full process of care, which includes attentiveness to needs and the allocation of responsibility. So, this is where we get this integrated approach that I was talking about. So the attentiveness, responsibility, competence, etc., responsiveness are all important, rather than just the giving of care. And then in terms of caregivers seeing organizational requirements as hindrances to rather than support for care, in large bureaucratic institutions, managers are often far removed from the daily practices of caregiving. In the context of higher education, university management may fail to recognize the need to disperse adequate funds or resources in order for caregiving to be effective. As a consequence, university teachers may maintain that they care despite the inadequate resources provided for their caregiving. So they would be in a compromised position then to provide good care. And then lastly, care work is distributed along the lines of class, caste, gender, and race. So often care is a devalued practice, and it results in the devaluing of those who engage in it. If we think of teaching as in relation to research, one is often finding teaching devalued. So it's often those with the lowest status in society who provide care that is either unpaid or badly compensated. In addition, their services are often unacknowledged by those with privilege and power who choose to absent themselves from these tasks, or what I've told you, receive passes out of doing this work. So in higher education, roles are often stratified, with young black women taking on teaching tasks and older white men being freed up to conduct more valued activities such as research. Also, the increasing casualization of university teaching has similar stratified positions, with a disproportionate number of women in contract positions and teaching part-time classes. I know that's true of my own institution. So these are the 7 warning signs that the institution is not caring well. And I hope that it's given you an example of how we can see care from a more enlarged perspective rather than just focusing on interpersonal relations. I'd like to leave some time for questions. These are the 2 important books, Moral Boundaries, A Political Argument for the Ethic of Care, which Tronte has written, and now her latest book on caring democracy, Markets, Equality and Justice. So she really is juxtaposing care with a neoliberal perspective. Other authors who've written on care are Selma Sevenhazen. She's written a book called Citizenship and the Ethics of Care. This is Fiona Robinson, who's an international relations person who's written a lot about globalizing care and the difference between care and justice perspectives. And then Eva, is that Kitay? Yeah, that is Eva Kitay, who's also written a lot on dependency and social policies in relation to caring for dependents. And the last one is Virginia Held, who's written about care from a policy perspective. This is a book by Tony Monchinsky. It's called Education in Hope. And he brings Dewey and those sorts of people, and also very much an ethics of care perspective, because Joan Tronto was his supervisor. So this book, I think, is his PhD. I've got a number of references for anyone who wants to pursue any of these approaches. And then just some references about using the capabilities perspective and critical feminist citizenship frameworks for social justice, on looking at how privileged irresponsibility can be used in higher education. So you'll have access to this presentation. Thanks a lot. questions or comments?
I'm not sure what it was raised last night, so it was, please just quiet. A lot of what you said today and last night resonated quite strongly with philosophical work on religion that's occurred in the last 50 years or so. I'm wondering whether you explore the potential overlap between the ethics of care and religious paradigms. In part because I think what's really interesting is some of the concerns that come out of the ethics of care, like mechanism, inequalities and hierarchies and selective caregiving rules that can occur. And so I'm just wondering, have you explored the interface
Between Ubuntu and care?
Ubuntu and the ethics of care?
Yeah. There have been papers written about it. In fact, my supervisor was quite interested in the notion because they do both start from a relational ontology. You know, I am because you are, this interpersonal thing. Other people, there was a whole issue of Hypatia, which is a feminist philosophy journal devoted to how Ubuntu and Confucianism and philosophies like that either relate to the ethic of care or don't. And some feminists were very critical, saying, you know, care has a sort of feminist agenda, whereas Confucianism and Ubuntu is accepting hierarchical relation. It's not questioning those. So some people would say, yes, they're very similar. And I was quite interested in it. So I taught a fourth year ethics class to social work students. And one of the essays I set for students was what are the similarities and differences between Ubuntu and care? And students generally thought that, you know, there were a lot of similarities, but they spoke about Ubuntu being in the blood. And, you know, I wondered if anyone here would, you know, have any comments about that. They were sort of really viewed it as an essentializing thing that people either had or they didn't have. But I think that it is an interesting question, but I would say that they have different agendas, really.
Thank you so much for broadening the notion of care and especially looking at care from an institutional perspective. It's very clear when one talks about the hierarchy of caregivers and care receivers, the way you split it out, especially in relation to women doing most of the teaching or being in contract positions. But I'm much more interested in the inherent competitiveness that underpins a lot of institutional prerogatives. You know, you compete at the level of publications, promotion, etc., etc. So how well does an ethics of care work within institutional cultures which are so strongly predicated on individualism? And so that's just it's kind of ethical question.
Well, I suppose that one could use the ethics of care to critique those individualist practices, because, you know, things like teaching, as I said, would be regarded as devalued because they are caring processes. And the ethics of care also says that those who are taking responsibility, like managers or doctors or whatever, are often very far removed from what's going on, you know, on the ground. I think also Tronto's distinction between the work ethic and the care ethic, she's written papers on this, might be illuminating from that perspective. So one is rewarded for doing particular types of activity, and some people are seen as deserving and others are seen as not deserving. So I think it's one can only use it as an alternative vocabulary to critique what is going on. Yeah. Yes.
I really enjoyed the presentation and the ideas, because for me what it does is it opens up and stretches our conceptions of learning and learning spaces beyond meeting the needs of the labour market and into a more human relational space, but in a very sensible, purpose-driven way, and I really like that.
Thanks.
So thank you.
Yeah. I know that you're going to be doing cultural historical activity theory afterwards, and I have also given a paper at a critical care conference on cultural historical activity theory and care, and why the two are very similar, because they both are dependent on this relational ontology and the social, and that one learns through the social. And the chairperson of my session was so rude. She said, if I see another one of those diagrams, I thought I'd escape those cultural historical activity theory. I think she was friendly with Anne Edwards, and she said, and she was sort of, instead of allowing people to contest the paper or contribute, she was having sort of her private argument with me, and she said, look, you can write a chapter for the book, but please do not write that one on Vygotsky and the ethic of care. So it's just lying there. But I do think that it's a fruitful sort of way of looking at learning, and it's a nice project to undertake. Yes, Michael.
I like the point you made when you referred to Nussbaum. The third point, that it's important to develop the narrative of imagination. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on how the narrative of imagination links on the one hand to care, and on the other hand to knowledge, which has been a major theme in this.
Yeah.
I just want to say that you talked about the role of the humanities. The humanities have always been associated with sentiment, feeling, humanism, and it's lost ground to the sciences in history because it's not been considered a part of knowledge.
Yeah.
And this is where I see Vygotsky, Brunner, and others arguing for a different role for the narrative imagination. So I wonder if, a more realistic role to do with how you perceive the world, that is knowledge. And I'm not seeing that argument coming forward when we talk about the role of the narrative imagination.
Well, what I thought she meant by the narrative imagination is in looking at stories which are different from different parts of the world, and being able to imagine what it's like for other people to live in different ways. That's what I understand it to mean, which I think is very sympathetic to a care ethic perspective. But the thing is that Nussbaum assumes that we can have empathy. The ethic of care is skeptical about that. They're skeptical, they use Iris Young's notion of asymmetrical reciprocity, where they say that often what happens is that we are projecting onto others what we imagine their circumstances to be. And the notion of attentiveness in care is the ability to see the you in you, to not project oneself onto another person, but to see them in their difference, if you know what I mean. So that's quite a difficult thing to do. I haven't thought about how it relates to knowledge, but I'm particularly interested in the politics of emotions and how emotions are very important in teaching and in reflecting on teaching. I think that the next chapter I have to write is how the ethics of care relates to emotions. And I'm going to have to, think carefully about that. I think somebody's phone is going. I'll have to think more about how that pertains to knowledge. Yeah.
I don't know if this is maybe just a thought that's come up in my head and probably won't come up very well. But I think it relates to the way in which we're discussing knowledge here this week. And it feels a little bit to me like there's a possibility that we could get into the problem of reification of this idea of the bodies of knowledge and lose the social, relational way of thinking about knowledge in relation to our life experiences and our ethics and our learning processes as we kind of like charge to transfer the bodies of knowledge and then, when we analyze how well we're doing that, it just feels to me like something there we need some way of, having and I really liked your presentation because I think it opens up a more sensitive space for the need to think about what are we saying about knowledge and education, and what are we saying about knowledge and the educational experience, what are we saying about knowledge and learning, which Michael asked the question this morning, the relationship to the everyday, and what Lynette was saying when she was reflecting on the end-to-end, that there's a learning process that I think there's something we have to do some work there still. And I think that this work really helps us begin to do.
I think it's sort of in the doing and, thinking about, how are people acquiring knowledge? So we, for example, looked at using these 5 elements of care in terms of giving and receiving feedback on a particular assignment. And, if you go through each one of these things of attentiveness is incredibly important in teaching. Each one of these things does make for a good practice, I think.
And you also seem to also be talking about care in a sort of like a social relation.
Yeah.
That if we think about something like, if I take the work that I work with, say biodiversity in the new knowledge area in the science curriculum.
Yeah.
But to really be able to learn about biodiversity, you need to care about. You need to care about what you're learning about.
Yeah.
And that is not just an acquisition.
That's right. That's right.
Of course, there's acquisition and there's high quality data and all these other things, but there's something else that goes on there too. And that was a little bit the question I was asking last night about the applications of our way we think about knowledge as well as the acquisition.
Yeah.
And there's something there that integrates care, knowledge, pedagogy. And I'm not sure how to express what I'm saying.
I think that Monchinsky book might be quite interesting for you to look at. It's also got to do with an expanded view of knowledge, I think, because as far as I understand biodiversity, it's quite transdisciplinary, isn't it? So this sort of myopic vision of the dyadic and that sort of thing, I think is quite a profound critique. Because when most people, there isn't just an ethics of care, there are many different ethics of care. And most people are familiar with people like Sarah Ruddick and Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings in particular, because she's applied the ethics of care to higher education, but it's very much in this sort of one-to-one mother-child relationship. And it really, you know, care involves the environment, it involves non-human others, and it's much more expansive.
I don't know if somebody's chairing the discussion.
I was trying to from behind.
Okay, yeah, it's such an interesting discussion, and I'm getting a sense maybe of what Ida's trying to get at. My issue is with a certain kind of dichotomizing which has been so prevalent between the kind of caring, emotional, affective side and the rational kind of knowledge-seeking.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this approach serves to reinforce that dual way of looking at the world and experiencing the world. And that's my only worry about this. Even though at a very personal level, this appeals to me, partly as a woman and a mother and being a teacher and all of those things. So I'm really concerned about that a more unified, maybe it's something we need to strive towards, way of bringing together the rational reasoning and in a way, I mean, like we all know how global climate is affected, and there's a scientific knowledge part of it. What happens with pollution, contamination, and so on. But the other side, that there are values that one has to have to even be concerned about knowing those things.
Yeah.
And that valuing part, the respect for biodiversity, at the same time knowing that not all diverse forms have to be preserved or can be preserved. I'm talking here now as a language person. Not all the languages of the world can be preserved, and there has to be some rational way of deciding which, how, and when.
Yeah.
So
I think
is there a way of bringing those together and thus strengthening this approach?
Well, I mean, I think Martha Nussbaum has really tried to bring what she thinks is the rational together with a sort of care perspective. Post-humanists would reject, you know, they're very critical of Nussbaum. And they're saying that what she's eulogizing is Eurocentric humanities, which we need to move beyond, you know. We don't just eulogize the rational. And that we do need alternative ways of thinking about the world, rather than just to be bringing the good news to everyone. But I think that she's attempted to, and the thing is that what I said from the beginning is that it's a normative framework. It's allowing us to sort of unpack the underpinning values. So maybe it's only useful in a particular way of looking at situations. But it might be interesting for you to see how things like social policy, for example, are unpacked from a care ethics perspective. Yeah.
This gentleman here has been getting
Okay. Sorry, I'm looking
for caring. Thank you so much
for noticing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. For me, it was quite useful. I really liked the way you broadened the scope of our understanding of care in the definition that you shared and also in the description. I, however, have a question around the way we continue to use the term caregiver when we are at the same time saying caregiving is limiting the scope of care. So what sort of language should we be using to show that, that broadness of care? That's my first question. Secondly, I seem to now see care as both an ethic and a value. And I was just wondering, as researchers who go out in the field and we interact with research participants, we could observe the need for care. What should be our attitude towards the research participants that we see who are in need of care? I mean, what we are looking for is data, but how do we respond so that at the end of the day, if we don't do anything, we are again seen as incompetent in care, I mean in exercising care. Yeah, so I've just been battling with those ideas in my mind.
I think they're very interesting, those ideas. I know that, I don't know if you're aware of, there's a book by Kenneth Plummer called Documents of Life, where he looks at life histories, and he brings in the ethics of care as part of research ethics, actually. And I think that, it's sort of, it's institutions these days who are very afraid of litigation, and all they care about really is that people aren't going to sue them. So I think that approaching research from a care ethics perspective would be a different sort of way of going about doing it. I mean, I suppose one would be put in quite a difficult situation if one is seeing need all around one and, just there to record it rather than to do something about it. And I suppose that also depends on the research approach one is taking. I suppose, needs are sort of endless. We will see them all the time, all around us. And as a researcher, if you are really there to get information from people, I suppose you would have to think of ways of doing it in, using these sort of care ethics as much as possible, attentiveness, take responsibility, competence. Because, competence is hugely important. And if one looks at education in South Africa, it is quite worrying in terms of competence. And, it might be affected by resources or whatever. But, if you are incompetent, then you're not caring properly. And we need to bear that in mind. I suppose that's where knowledge also comes in. So if we're teaching erroneous things, then, you can be as well-meaning as you like, but it's not going to be doing anyone any good. I'll have to think about a different word for the caregiver, but there is a process of giving care, the sort of hands-on thing. And that the person who's taking responsibility, as I said, might be like the head of the household, who thinks that his caring role is to be giving money, for example, and who's not doing the hands-on work of care. So it's easier to extricate yourself from the actual hands-on and just say, okay, here's some resources for you, or just give. And if I've answered all your questions.
Yeah.
So who was next?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really keen to look at how one could use what you described as the normative framework. Is the ethics of care as a normative framework to unpack underlying values? That's one piece that I'm just hanging on to at the moment.
Yes.
And then trying to make sense of what that would look like. And what I'm interested in hearing from you, perhaps just to think through what that would look like if one took that framework and used it to look at governance at a higher educational institution, and tying that directly into the social justice element, because at the end of the day, it's about resource access and distribution, and governance plays a critical role in that at a higher ed. So if one would take the normative framework, what would that look like?
Well, you would, these questions that I put up here, you would ask questions like these sorts of things. So, for example, we looked at the welfare white paper in South Africa, and you sort of almost do a discourse analysis of what is being claimed and what has been said, and then you apply these sorts of principles, and what comes out is quite interesting. So if you are interested, I could send you some papers which has used this approach to analyze policy or practice or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you.
Who's next? I think
Mine was just
a response.
To the issues of being a researcher and encountering a situation in which one feels prompted to care. And a small caveat that really goes to the point on responsibility is that sometimes I think we need to be reflexive and be aware of our motivations in wanting to respond to the care, and be aware of the power that is involved with being a researcher and coming from the outside into a situation. I think we've all seen sort of well-meaning people come in and disempower people and cause more harm than good. And so just raising that flag.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting you do such.
But I think reflexivity is incredibly important, because care does talk a lot to power relations. I think there, then there.
Thanks very much. I just find comfort that the particular question that Priya asked yesterday in terms of the country that we live in and the disparities of the past and what a teacher, because the kind of care would differ in each and every country depending on the historical contexts and what issues are pertinent. But I think it's also, as we look at social justice, we also need to look in our context, particularly in matters of moral degeneration, and also the issues of, I know you talk about male and female, but also the blurred boundaries between male and female, and also what those blurred boundaries and their relationship with moral degeneration and also social justices, that somehow or other, as we look at care, we also need to teach our students areas of care and how they should differentiate between areas which go beyond what is just care, which may look like care because of the issues of gender blurring and moral degeneration. But I also like the fact that you referred to that students also need to be accountable, but at the same time, students also need to guide on the care that is suitable for them. I just want to make
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what you mean about blurred boundaries and also moral degeneration. So maybe you could elaborate a little on
Yes,
this.
what I'm meaning is sometimes care, particularly from very naive children, might be conceived as care, yet it may be deteriorate into sexual abuse or whatever. So there is moral degeneration, and the relationship between male and female, even in the class context, is completely changed. And therefore, I think as we talk about care, the learners also need to understand what care is and what kind of care is they may expect.
Yeah. I think it is important for people to know what good care is and what bad care is, and to have the expectation that they should, that's what the ethic of care says, that we should be able to give and receive care in situations of choice, and it should be good care. But I think what the ethic of care also tries to contest is that care should only be done by certain people in the world, and that it should be taken for granted. Because if we look at South African society, from a race perspective, whites have depended on blacks to service their needs, and they have not really acknowledged that. So, one could see that as a form of privileged irresponsibility. And, one of the first papers Tronto wrote was about Chile racists in the classroom, and the fact that, and spoke about privileged irresponsibility. So, I think those are important things. Yes.
I've been fascinated throughout the week about the strong discourses around learning and disciplines, and learning being within disciplines, and that being maybe a major purpose of learning. Like I said, I really enjoyed your presentation. It occurs to me that care in your presentation and in the way we've been talking about it in the last few days is seen as an additional. You do it in addition to doing your disciplinary work of teaching or so forth. And for me, it seems counterintuitive. Surely it's a deficit. If you're not caring, then you're deficient in the work that you're doing as a teacher, rather than that you're doing extra things if you're caring. Because of the space that we operate in, and because for me, learning is not about the labour market. Learning is about life and operating in the world, including towards the labour market. And I'm finding it very fascinating, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that it's seen as an addition rather than a deficit if you're a carer or not a carer.
Well, I'll take you back to the definition, which is seeing it as a practice. So she would see teaching as a caring practice. Teaching is a form of care. And what she says, everything we do to continue, maintain, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So teaching could be considered as a way of leading to human flourishing. And it can either be done well or it can be done badly. And if you're not paying attention to the moral elements involved in that caring process, then you won't be doing teaching well. So it's a different mindset to seeing it as just a disposition, caring about. But it's actually a form of labor, care, or a practice or a process. And so the process of teaching is very important. It's not just what comes out at the end. It's the very things that we're doing, from moment to moment, which is important.
Sorry, I think that's where the ethics of care, for me the emphasis then becomes on ethics. Because ethics is more than a disposition, it's more than a social practice. It becomes inherent in who we are and our being in this world, and how we are in this world with people and with those whom we relate to. So I find that the emphasis almost it's resting on the ethics.
Yeah. Well, in that it's been used as a normative framework because you're making moral judgments about whether something's been done well or it's not been done well. But those ethics that she's developed have come from the phases of care. She's derived them from the... Yes.
It's interesting that we spent a lot of time this week on the reappropriation of the knowledge project. And in reappropriating the knowledge project, is there something that's not there in the way that the knowledge project is being represented in our discourses? That we need to, as Priya was saying, have this additive dimension, knowledge with care. Now, it's almost as if, my speculation is it's almost as if we don't have an adequate way of thinking about knowledge as caring. Okay, because it's a sort of signifying of the world relationally. And it's constituted as higher order representations of things. So that we've got this decoupling of the knowledge project, even in our deliberations, where we'd be comfortable as universities and as teachers that we're winning back the knowledge project in our curriculum, and we're likely to be more effective. But we still have the dilemma of the cognitive and affective differentiation that disembeds knowledge from its the manner in which it's epistemically constituted. Because the epistemic constitution of knowledge is not a process that's stripped of care. It's implicated in dealing with the things that matter, and therefore giving attention to what needs care. And so I just wanted to speculate that the knowledge project, as we're representing it, we probably don't have the adequacy in our tools of representation to produce the coupling necessary to deal with these matters. We only can deal with them as additively as
Yeah, as Haley was saying. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose it's how one gets. I mean, I wasn't here, so I don't know what you discussed, but and it's a pity because it's sort of coming in as something additional now. But I do think it's the how. How does one do it? How do students acquire it? How, what is the process?
You talk about the epistemology of care.
Yeah, she talks about the epistemology, the ontology, the politics of care, and I think she talks about theoretico-juridical versus expressive collaborative notions. So she's not very, she would be supporting, I don't know if she would support the knowledge project, because she's more interested in the expressive collaborative forms of knowledge production, rather than the experts holding themselves up as the only knowledgeable ones. Yes. Just looking at the clock.
I'm sorry.
No, carry on.
Thank you very much. You've really taken me out of my regular field. But in my own context, as I was working with people, they kept saying, if you do it nicely, it will happen. And it seems to me that it's joining up, perhaps, with what Rob's saying, because I was thinking through what is doing it nicely. It's talking nicely to people around you. If you do things in the right way, then things work, and you achieve your objectives. If you want to make a fire, they'll say, do it nicely. Now, what they mean is, be attentive, be mindful, put everything into it, and do it with all your being, and you'll get that fire. And if you're scatty, you're doing it properly, you're arguing, it's not going to happen. So there seems to me there's quite a tight binding between care and this idea of doing it nicely. It takes it from care as a slightly sort of fluffy, social
huggy feeling,
something with direction.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And my supervisor, Selma, wrote a paper on attentiveness, a very nice paper on attentiveness. And she encouraged Joan to write a book on each one of these elements, which she hasn't done. She's not very good about she loses all the papers she writes. I keep writing to her and say, you'd remember that paper you gave, can you send it to me? But so she's not very in the mode of getting the publications out there. But I think that's exactly, the sort of thing one would look at with attentiveness. And a very good example, doing things nicely.
Just ask one provocative question.
Yes.
Is there something wrong with being warm and fuzzy about the things about being in this world I can understand the carefulness of the theory, and I completely can buy into it, and I think it's a wonderful way to talk within a professional space. But just generally, is there some sort of disease that I've got that I don't understand? Is there something wrong with being human in a human world when we're engaged in human activity?
I don't think there is, but I think that it's not everything. And if one is doing things without resources, no matter how warm and whatever one is not going to be accomplishing things. You might get very frustrated. I also sort of think that they're common sense notions of care, which are the warm and fuzzy, and people can turn right off it because of that. And I think it's more, it's quite complex. And it requires a lot of thought and deliberation. What is really useful is for looking at particularity and context.
I agree. I'm not dismissing at all. I'm just saying.
But people wanted to respond to you. I jumped in.
Thank you. I'm going to
okay.
So that you can go. I'm just like.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.